Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. So we're going to have a look in this video at the mocking options we've got. So I'm going to open this Echo Postman logic app here, and we'll give that a second to come up. So workflow's opening up, and you can see, so it's a pretty simple workflow. We get a request here. We then perform a get operation against. So Postman's got this like mock sort of Echo API, so we can just call that API and it'll just echo back the response that we've got. So we're just going to trigger that and then return a response. So really simple logic app here. What we're going to look at though is how we test it and how we can kind of mock this this call to Postman. So the idea here is I've got two tests down in the unit test project. The first one is very similar if you've watched the previous video about testing locally. What I'm going to do here is we'll spin the function runtime up down at this point here like we do normally. We're going to pass in the name of that Echo Postman workflow here, and we've just got this sort of empty JSON object we're going to pass in to trigger it. Now, if you just note the expected URL up here, so what we're going to do if we look further down, we trigger the logic app here, we check it works, we check the run history, we're going to check the HTTP action here, and then so that means it's going to have called Postman, and then we're going to get the response back. And then what we do is, I think if I remember right, in the response, where are we? So we're going to return the body here of the response, that of the kind of the message we got from Postman. So in the test, what that means is we're going to get a URL back in that logic app response, and we're going to check that the URL equals this value here. So what I can do, if I'm just going to pause the video a second and get the right commands to run the test. So I think what we're going to do, I'm just going to debug through this test to show what happens. So I'm going to trigger this test here, and we're waiting for the debugger to be attached. So I'm going to go and connect up here, and we want 3216. It's down the bottom there. Okay, so we then press play so we can start stepping through this test now. So you can see here we start off, so we get our object, we sort of start setting up the test host builder, and we go and configure it, and this is spinning up the function's runtime now. So if you remember from previous videos, that copies all the workflow files and the config into a folder, points the function runtime to it, and now the function runtime's up and running. We're then going to create our logic app test manager, which allows us to call the workflow. So we then do a post here to the workflow. I'm going to check we get a run ID, so we've got a run ID there. We load the workflow run history so we can start checking what happened, and then we can start making assertions. So the trigger was successful, the HTTP call to Postman, we can check that was successful, the response action was successful, and then the run overall workflow run status was a success as well. Now this is the bit we care about here, so we can see we get a whole bunch of data back from the Postman API, and what we're expecting is that the URL property, so we'll see if we can see that here. So we're looking for this one, so we can see we got back this Postman echo get there. So if that's successful, we know all's good and that test was green. So the key thing is that one actually called out to Azure and ran that called out from the local runtime out to Postman, executed the Postman API, got the response back. Now, that's without mocking, so if we want to mock that call to Postman, so say we want to simulate error conditions or we want to use different response data, so this is where we can use this other class here, the tests with mock, and this will actually demonstrate how to do that. So here we've got exactly the same start, only the key difference is we're going to create this custom mock object. So here what I'm going to do is create a JSON object that we'll send back, but for the URL property here, I'm just going to supply that value mocked URL instead of the Postman URL, so we can check that later on. Now, I spin up my workflow runtime here. I'm going to do a load. So this is where the load and build we do separately here because we're going to manipulate some of the configuration. So we load the workflow, which will go and create the folder. It'll create the files ready for us to spin the runtime up. And then the new bit is we're now going to create this mock HTTP host, so you can have multiple of these. And what we're going to do is create an endpoint that we can create locally that the workflow is going to call. Okay, so what happens next is we've got the mock HTTP host running. This bit here is where what we're going to do is read in. So this is the app settings JSON that the test host builder we've told it is available. So when we did the kind of load step, it copies the settings from your logic app over here. It copies this folder and it copies all this config into a temp folder to run your test against. Now what we're going to do here is load up the app settings, and then in my app settings JSON there's a property called Postman echo URL, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the mock host object. I'm going to set the host URI and then /get to be the endpoint that I want, and that's really what my HTTP action, if you remember over here, my HTTP action's using this parameter which gets picked up from the app settings. So if I go back to my test here, what I'm doing is I'm changing the URL that action's going to use to point to my test host instead of pointing to Postman. So that'll basically set up or modify my app settings, and then the mock HTTP host here is really just a wrapper on a NuGet package called wiremock. So what I'm going to do is in my mock host I'm going to go, so it's like a Fluent style setup here, so I can set my server up to say, given we get a request with the path /get, when it's a get request, then we want to respond with a 200 with this HTTP header, and then we're going to use the body that we created up here. We're going to supply that as the response body. So I can actually configure multiple responses on this this mock HTTP server, and I could just have it respond with different values depending on, say if the workflow calls 3 or 4 different endpoints, I can have different messages going back for this test case. Next off, what we need to do, so we've set up our mock HTTP server. We're now going to use the build function on the workflow test host. So remember, we split build and load to 2 separate steps. So build basically goes and spins up the function runtime now. Then we're going to go and execute our test exactly the same as before. Set up the test manager, we call the logic app, we assert a bunch of stuff, get the run history, and then the bit that changes down the bottom is when we make the assertion down here, we expect the URL to be a different value because we didn't really call Postman, we just called our mock server. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to put a few breakpoints in, and we're going to check kind of what's going on here. So I'm going to just run this test now. So we should expect that to ask me to step into the debugger. So connect to 148.2. Okay, so we've connected, and now we're going to run this test. So we step through here. So here's my JSON object that my mock server is going to respond with. And you can see that the URL value is just mocked URL. We're then going to build or set up the test host for running the workflow. So that basically copies over our files ready to go. We spin up the mock HTTP host. I'm now going to replace that Postman URL. So we can see here, there's nothing sensitive in there. Yeah, it's all right. So you can see I've replaced that setting with my local host one here. So you can see the desktop port 7075/get. For that, just to, I guess, a step back, for that mock HTTP host, if I've got multiple of them, there's overloads on the constructor to pass different port numbers and stuff for them if you wanted to as well. So you can have multiple mock HTTP hosts, or you can just use different paths if you've got multiple endpoints to call. We're then setting up our host to respond with a message given a call on a certain path. And then we spin up the function runtime. And then the Logic App Test Manager client set up. So we trigger the Logic App here, so it's going to call out. Get our run ID back, load the run history. And then we're just going to step over, we check all the actions ran. And then this time when we check the response, we should see, where are we? So on the text, right? Yeah. So there's the mocked URL. It is the property we got back, so we know that called our mock server and it didn't call Postman. So we know that we've successfully mocked the Postman HTTP call now. With our Logic app, with this mocking approach, we can now mock all the HTTP calls. We should be able to mock the connectors as well. So I'll probably do a video at some point about how to do that. And then you can set up more advanced scenarios using multiple mock servers or multiple responses. And the idea would be if I've got, like, say, 3 or 4 different test cases, I can just create the appropriate responses to support those different test cases. And I think that this is meant to be just an intro video to get you up and running. And I think I'll do a more advanced scenario showing a more complicated workflow at a future point. Thanks for listening.